Very good morning to you. Welcome. Well, I don't know. The old year's going to go out with a bit of a bang, isn't it? We've got snow promised, possibly, for many of us. And this virus is not abating. Indeed, the figures are worse than they've been at any other time in the year, even right at the beginning in April when we were in full lockdown. The figures were not as bad. We have to listen to the news to know what's going on and to know what we should be doing where we are. But we mustn't be bowed down by what we hear. And I thought about David as an example for us to look at today. If you look at 1 Samuel 30, if you can take the time today to read the whole of the chapter, it will be a blessing to you. It's one of my favourite chapters in the whole Bible, I think, because it's so rich. It's so rich with imagery, but also with wisdom. But we're only going to look at the beginning of it this morning, because I'm going to try and stay under 10 minutes. Talking about one of my favourite chapters, that's going to be quite difficult. But the situation is that David has a band of men living with him and they've settled in a town called Ziklag. And they have wives and children, and they've been there a while. And they've had to flee. All of them are people who Saul has tried to destroy, and they've gathered their bandits and well, I suppose we'd call them hooligans, or I don't know, but they were the riffraff, and they joined David when he fled from Saul, and he'd moulded them into a fighting force, and they'd been away from home, and it took them 3 days to travel home, and I can imagine they were very tired and weary and looking forward to being at home, looking forward to all the home comforts in Ziklag with their families waiting for them. And 1 Samuel 30 says, "Now when David and his men came to Ziklag on the 3rd day, the Amalekites had made a raid upon the Negev and upon Ziklag. They had overcome Ziklag and burned it with fire and taken captive the women and all who were in it, both small and great. They killed no one, but carried them off and went their way. And when David and his men came to the city, they found it burned with fire, and their wives and sons and daughters taken captive. And David and his people who were with him raised their voices and wept until they had no more strength to weep. David's 2 wives also had been taken captive." They were greatly just if you use your imagination, put yourself in the place of one of these men in David's group. They have been away from home, probably for much longer, doing various things, and they travelled for 3 days, and they'd walked. They didn't ride. They walked. They travelled for 3 days. They were hot and dusty and tired. And as they approach the city, they can see smoke and smell smoke. And so they begin to run, and they run into the city, and they find no bodies, but everything gone. Everything of value has been taken. All the people are gone. All the animals are gone. The place is empty, and it has burned to the ground. They've lost everything. And they spend all day weeping. They weep and lament. And you'd think, having travelled for 3 days, that they were tired and weary, and that was going to be the end of it. But they're confronted with a worse disaster than what they've been living through. And then, verse 6, David was greatly distressed, for the people spoke of stoning him, because all the people were bitter in soul, each for his sons and daughters. So not only are they crying and wailing and weeping, but suddenly they say, well, it's David's fault. If he hadn't taken us off on this raid we were on, if he'd brought us home a day earlier, it's his fault. If it wasn't for David, we'd have been here, and we'd have protected our wives and children. and they turned on David. So things went from very bad, the place is burned, the people are gone, to dreadful for David, because these loyal men turned on him. And the next part of the verse 6, the end of verse 6 says, "But David strengthened himself in the Lord his God." How did David handle disaster upon disaster? He had lost everything. His wives, his 2 wives were gone, and his children. And everyone was, and he saw, and he must have felt as leader that in some way responsible for what had happened, because it was his choice to lead them away at that point. We often blame ourselves when disaster comes. We think, well, if I'd behaved differently, perhaps it wouldn't have worked out the way it has. But that's not a good way to go. So here let's parallel this to our life. We thought the first lockdown was bad. Then we were given some freedom. Not much freedom, but some freedom. And then we came into the autumn and it looked all right, and then the figures started to go up again. And we were in another lockdown for a month. And then the tier system. And now, just when we think, well, it must be getting better, it's getting worse and worse. There's a new strain and it's getting worse. How do we face it? How do we face the possibility that we may have to go into complete lockdown again? How do we face it? The way that David faced it. David faced the new bad turn in his circumstances by strengthening himself in the Lord. He turned to God, not away from God. He turned to God and worshipped, strengthening his inner man in the knowledge that God was in control, that God knew what was happening, that God would keep everyone safe, that God was on his side. The knowledge that God had chosen him, that God had anointed him, that he had a purpose for David's life. And all those things we can say of ourselves. Whatever you're facing, God has not left you. God is with you. He understands. He has good purposes for you. He hasn't lost the plot. This new virus strain has not caught him unawares. This new extreme situation has not caught him napping. No, he knows all about it. And this is an opportunity for us to step forward in faith. And perhaps you don't know quite how to do this. How do you lift your spirits when everything about you seems somber and low and depressing? Well, the way out of feeling blue is to sing. It is to worship. It is to lift up your voice and praise God. And can I encourage you, if you never use the Sanctuary Space playlists, do, because each one of them has been chosen, and each list of songs, about 14 or 15 in each playlist, if you listen to them and join in and reach out to God in worship, he will lift your spirits. We can stay down in the dumps if we want to. It is actually our choice. David could have stayed sitting there with his head in his hands, or he could have run away from these men. But he didn't do either thing. He sought the Lord and strengthened himself in the Lord. And when he did that, he got the answer of what to do about the situation. We need to reach out to God. Strengthen yourself in the Lord. Remind yourself of all the things he's done for you, of the wonderful way in which he's helped you, of all his goodness and kindness. Think about him. Think about Jesus. Think about what Jesus paid the price for you. Do you think he's going to suddenly abandon you now we're in this difficult situation? No, he's not. He's got it in hand. And this is where our faith comes in. We trust him to bring us through this. Whatever this is going to turn out to be, he will bring us through it. And we need to be strong enough to help others around us to get through it as well, as David helped his men get through this difficult situation. That's my thought for the day. My time is up. I'll see you tomorrow.